We're rolling into closing statements at this point. I do believe Jay is up first. You have 7 minutes to summarize your arguments.
Okay.
I will start the time when you're ready.
Okay. Yeah, got it. So this has been a great discussion, very engaging. I've learned things that I wasn't aware of, so I want to thank Dr. Shabir for that. My closing analysis would be that I think that the majority of the texts that I've listed, again, many of those are not vague. They actually deal with several cases where the angel of the Lord is not merely a created being, but in fact identified as God himself. Again, I gave many of those examples. And so in I think the first or second rebuttal, Dr. Shabir went into talking about Gabriel and angels when I had already talked about the fact that I made the distinction between sometimes angel can be a created angelic being and sometimes it can be referred to as God himself, to which he then said, well, there's clearer texts that say X, Y, Z. One of the problems with the notion of the philosophy of language or the way that we understand interpretation, he's an exegete, he's a hermeneuticist, he should know that there's no prima facie way necessarily to know when something is clear. That's all based on the assumptions that we have about our position or this or that. Now, in a relative sense, could you say that something is clear? Sure. But again, that's going to be depending upon one's system or one's paradigm to know which, in fact, this or that text is clearer. And so if I have a presupposition about the transcendence and unity of God that's somehow, say, superior to distinctions in God, then I'm going to automatically see that any of the texts that I go to that talk about God's unity, they're somehow clearer, right? But in the way that Deuteronomy phrases the laws about coming prophets, right? We are told that a prophet must speak in accord with previous revelation. He can't speak out of accord with it, right? That becomes, I think, problematic when we get into Ezekiel or these other texts, Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel 10, where we have this, again, Son of Man character, which he said was a poetic device. Now, that's interesting because I don't think it's in any way plausible to say that in Daniel 7, it's a representation of Israel that is before the Ancient of Days. This is the angel. This is the one like a son of man who was present in the fiery furnace. Right, the story of in Daniel of the angel. We would say the angel of the Lord, one like a son of man, in the fiery furnace. So is that the same? Is that the representation of Israel in the fiery furnace? I don't find the poetic explanation very convincing. And on top of that, there's many cases in Isaiah where, especially Isaiah 53 with the suffering servant, where it can be both and. It doesn't have to be either or. Is there an element to a historical fulfillment in Isaiah with the suffering servant of Israel in her history? Absolutely. But that doesn't negate the possibility of it also having a deeper fulfillment in the person of Christ when he came as the consummation and fulfillment of who and what Israel is and was and what was her historic mission. I would add too, again, something I didn't get to in my initial discussion was on top of messianic prophecies, there's not just messianic prophecies about who the Messiah would be and many of the ones that I listed. There's also predictions of, again, the Gentile church. When the Messiah comes, one of the key signs that everyone will know signifies that the Messiah has come is specifically the conversion in mass of many of the Gentile nations to the Messiah, and that would make up his kingdom. Jeremiah 25:18, 16, 19 through 21, 38, 31 to 34, Jeremiah 3:14 to 19, Hosea 1, 10 and 11, Malachi 1, 11 and 12, Habakkuk 2, 14 and 15, Ezekiel 47, 21 to 23, Micah 4, 1 through 4, Zechariah 2, 15, 8, 21 to 23, Tobit 13, 13, Tobit 14, 5 through 7, Joel and Acts. If you look at Acts 2, the way Acts 2 cites Joel, Isaiah 25, 6 through 8, Isaiah 24, 14 through 17, Isaiah 42, 1 through 8, Amos 9, 11 and 12, Isaiah 42, 4, Isaiah 49, 1 through 6, verse 8, 22 to 23 of that same chapter, Isaiah 9, 1 and 2, Isaiah 11, 10 through 12, Psalm 86, Psalm 67, Psalm 110, Isaiah 66, Isaiah 51, 1 through 7, Isaiah 54, 2 and 3, Isaiah 55, Isaiah 18, 20 to 25, many, many more. But now, are we going to think that these are all textual corruptions? Why would Jews textually corrupt things that would aid Christians, right? Now, maybe they didn't know, maybe the Septuagint had all these texts that the Christians misappropriated. But when we start getting into this corruption of the texts, it doesn't really make any sense to see how the corruption of all of these texts, or the corruption of all of what's gone on in Leviticus and Numbers and Exodus, how in any way that aids the Jewish case. Like, what purpose does it serve for them to corrupt all those texts? And in my estimation of the when I was doing the interrogation, I didn't hear, to my satisfaction, a coherent response as to where all of those texts are, or what happened to all this altar, sacrifice, etc. Now, the argument might be turned on me. Well, you don't have an altar. You don't have the sacrifice as it's laid out. But actually, we do. Again, the whole book of Hebrews is dedicated to Paul interpreting the significance, the spiritual reality that all of those Levitical and Exodus tabernacle ceremonies that they have for us. So in fact, absolutely it is correct that Jesus did not come to abrogate the law, but rather to fulfill, right? So in fact, if you look at the way Paul consistently cites Leviticus, or when he cites Deuteronomy, or when he cites ceremonial laws, as they are sometimes called, Paul applies those spiritual principles to the church. And the law was always intended to have a spiritual principle, right? Leviticus says in Leviticus 19, you shall not hate your brother from your heart, right? So when Jesus is saying you have to love your brother, right, he's in harmony with Leviticus. So we actually put a strong stress on the continuity of the Old into the New Testament. And in fact, I would argue that one of the strongest proofs of Christianity and the deity of Christ is precisely all of what you see in the Exodus revelation of the tabernacle, all of what you see in Leviticus, even down to the point of the 8th day circumcision, Jesus in Luke, right? We get into Numbers, the ceremonies, that all points to Christ.
Cool. Thank you very much.